I'd just like to ask Peter Schlosser now to give us his closing remarks, followed by Garry Jacobs. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, everybody, for a very rich conversation. As we have had to expect, it had many strands, a lot of uh, individual, phenomena that are coming together that really create this moment of transition. In essence, the way I see it is, and trying to bring a lot of these things together is the turbulences are just an expression of a complex system that is in transition. And what you have in these situations is you have a higher level of excitation of the complex system. And if you get to a certain level, you get to resonances, and that brings certain part of the system down. If you want to see it in a positive sense, it actually then leads to reorganization of the complex system into a new state. And that was actually mentioned that we are in that. Now, transitions always happened. If you look through history, we always had transitions. We have the rise of structures, intellectual structures, political structures, power structures, and the fall, typically at a high cost. So our challenge here is to say, can we make that transition without the high cost? Can we learn from the past? So far, humankind has not shown a great capacity to be good learners from history. This is our moment to say, can we actually do that in the face of major challenges, but also opportunities? Can we move more to opportunity side rather than the challenge side? That is something that is clearly, on our mind, and I saw that sort of coming through the discussions. In that context of understanding what that complexity does, we have to, I think, be a little bit clearer between the distinction of root causes and derivatives of some small set of root causes. Because I think that we are still putting root causes into the category of, in essence, impacts from some movers as root causes. So that's something that we should pay attention to as we are moving forward. For example, climate is always coming up as the major issue. Climate is an outcome of too many people using too much energy of the wrong source. Now, yes, we feel it, we should pay attention to it, but the climate solutions are not in the domain of climate, they are in the domain of energy, in the domain of behavior of using this energy. Another question then is, looking at this fundamental concept of a complex system in transition, the ultimate complex system, of course, being the Earth system, can we anticipate what we want and where the transition should go? What do we want to transition to? And that really is something that has to be future focused. We have to look back, we have to learn from it, but our focus has to be on which future can we imagine, given all the complexities. Do we really want to, just float along, or do we really ask that fundamental question? What is our capacity as human beings? We believe we control the Earth system. Far from true. We are part of nature. We have capacities that actually allowed us to get out of balance with the life supporting systems. Do we truly have the capacity to understand the system and to change it? Or are we simply floating along as one part, imagining that we have control? That's a very fundamental, very deep philosophical, metaphysical question that along the parts of our considerations on action, we always have to keep in mind in the background. So if we are now looking at some of the, I already mentioned climate, but AI is another thing that is everywhere in the discussion. AI, we have to keep in mind, this is not something that came out of nowhere all of a sudden. People have, sometimes that feeling that with the appearance of ChatGPT and other generative AI all of a sudden appeared. AI is with us since decades. Look at your home, look at your car, look at your cell phone, look at all the environment in which we move. It was a slow buildup that now crosses some thresholds where it becomes much more powerful. Somebody mentioned, it takes on new capacities on timescales of months to years. Now the challenge for us is we enabled it. When I say we, it is academia and society as a whole. We enabled it, but along the way, we lost our capacity to understand what the consequences of it is. A lot of good is coming from AI. We should make use of that. But there are also a lot of negative consequences. Just one example, Trump, Musk, Doge was mentioned. Without AI, we couldn't write 2 million letters to fire people within 10 minutes, right? So we couldn't connect databases that are used for vindictive action rather than for positive action. So as we are moving forward, I think we have to pay much more attention to understand what is the positive side of AI and use it, but also keep in mind where AI can influence us in a much more, negative way, in a sense. So now closing out then, looking at that complex system approach to the state of our planet and the transition that we are in, a very fast transition, faster than academia works. What does it mean for academia, for universities? We are all coming from that background. What is our role? What is our responsibility? What is our moral obligation? And in my view, it's going back to the point where we really have to rethink universities, where we have to rethink academia. We have moved out of the domain of trust by society. We have isolated ourselves by thinking way too abstract, not connected to what the world needs. This has to come back to a point where we are part of society, where we are serving society, where we fulfill our mandate that society gives us to be one of the primary knowledge generators for society to move safely into the future. It needs different models. We have to go away from only reductionist science. I'm not saying we have to abolish it. We need this idea space, but we have to add with a significant capacity holistic thinking, transdisciplinary thinking, thinking for impact, action for impact, transgenerational, lifelong learning, empowering those whose world we are just destroying. Give them the space they deserve. Let's go back to the original idea of a university. We deviated from that with a lot of benefits for a certain period of time. That time has ended. We have to go back to the original idea of the university. That is where I think WAAS has a major opportunity to guide us, where some of us have to be brave enough to break some of the academic systems that hinder us to be the force for society that society deserves. So these are my general observations, and I'm sure we will continue to probe them, to discuss them, have other perspectives, but it's urgent. We have no time to contemplate too long. We have to be willing to take risks in this experimentation. If we follow the typical academic procedure of trying to be 99.99% certain, which we never are, we lose too much time. The world has bypassed us. We are now in the shadow of what is happening. We have to make a major effort to get ahead of it in terms of understanding what lies before us, what can lie before us, and become a major mover of a trajectory that will lead to positive outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Garry, your closing thoughts?
Peter, it would be very hard to follow what you just said. That was so rich and so comprehensive, and I think a very powerful message for us to take forward from this. I'd like to thank all the panelists who have participated so far because I think the contributions universally were very rich. And I would like to leave time to hear from all others who have not had a chance, who would like things to share. First, by reminding you that this is an invitation to collaborate in the future. And that was the purpose of this meeting, was really as an invitation and to put issues on the table. A couple of comments. We did not conceive of this program, this event, as a program on education. But it certainly is rightfully a program about education. And I think when we look at it from an evolutionary point of view, we can see that education has been one of the most fundamental institutions, maybe we could say one of the greatest organizations humanity has ever created, because it's the institution by which we learn from our past experience, organize it, and take it and try to pass it on to the next generation so they don't have to repeat reinventing the wheel and making all the mistakes that past generations have made. And so I think it's more than a coincidence that so much of the discussion, which was not planned to be, goes back to the roots of how the educational system has to change. Why? Why education? It's not the economy, it's not the technology per se, though it's connected to everything else, of course. It's because education is the thing where we're trying to consciously improve the way we develop and give the next generation an insights and capacities that we don't have, or we haven't had, or we haven't fully capitalized on. So I think it's right that education is a core part of this. And Peter was so eloquent in describing some of the limitations of education that have to be overcome. And there's much more to it. And he's also talked about AI. And I would just say one of the projects that we have been collaborating with Bridges and ASU on is looking at the future of education. Now that AI is there, the figures show that we should double the capacity for higher education in the world in the next 15 or 20 years to give, not to reach the level that's there in the most developed countries in the world, but to reach about double where the whole world is today. We need to create double the institutional capacity. And now we have a technology that could really make that possible. Doubling the existing system and the existing knowledge is not going to solve all our problems. We have to learn, as Peter said, from the limitations in our existing content, our existing way of learning, our existing way of thinking. And trying to understand the world we live in, because the educational system, like many other institutions, is part of the problem. We perpetuate theory on economics about what economy is and what was our GDP that one of our panelists was talking about instead of production purpose. We have economic theory that preserves and increases the focus on outmoded ideas that are incompatible with the future of humanity and the sustainability of humanity. So education is not just the process of teaching, it's the process of the intellectual perspectives that we're passing on to the next generation. And in that way, it ranks very, very high to the top on my list of areas which should change if we're going to tackle the challenges that we face. There are many areas we haven't talked about today, and I'm just mentioning them to put them on the list for future discussion. The Academy is promoting a project we call the Peace Offensive. We're working now with Club of Rome and European Academy of Sciences and beginning to spread out on it. There are things we can do to address pockets of violence and tension and conflict at all levels in global society. We don't have that institutional makeup now. It's an area that could have a big impact on reducing the turbulence. Another area we haven't really talked about except in very briefly is if human security is so important to building the confidence and the willingness of youth to look positively to the future and work for it, employment is a critical factor in that. The Academy ran years of programming on the need for changing policy and theory in employment, and I'm only going to mention one thing. Good, solid research done in the US shows that the cost of the society to unemployed people is far higher than the cost that would be there to pay them to work. Cost in terms of violence, crime, health problems, mental health problems, the loss of the most precious resource we have, which is really the human resource. So there's ample evidence and data on and strategies to address this. As we talk about radical changes in education, we have to be looking at radical changes in other areas too, which will be to the maximum benefit of society and also address the human security at the foundation. So I'd like to stop there, again, thanking all of you who have contributed so far and made this possible. And Grant, let's open it up and see if there's someone else who would like to share their thoughts.
If you could please put your comments in the chat bar or in the Q&A section, or simply raise your hand. To kick things off, I have a question for Ambassador O'Donnell, who's obviously experienced firsthand the complexities of human communication around the world through his work. My question is, policies don't implement themselves, people do. Garry was talking earlier about a new breed of leader that's needed in the world. How would you paint the picture of the ideal leader? What personality and characteristics would they need to have to implement what we've been talking about today?
That's a very good question. And many years ago, when I gave a talk to a youth forum in Rome, I tried to distill what I thought would be the kind of profile of ideal leadership. So I will try and dig it up and post it here if we have another moment or two. But basically, I think what we have at the moment in the world is a real deficit of integrity and accountability and leadership. And the group of former leaders called the Elders, when Mary Robinson was still at the helm of it, brought this out in one of their missives. And I think I think we have, in that regard, a number of organizations which bring together former and sometimes current world leaders to think about global challenges, including challenges of leadership itself. The oldest of these seems to be the Interaction Council that I've been involved with for quite some time. And I will be giving a brief talk at a dinner to them in Dublin next Tuesday. And they will begin their next 39th plenary, I think it is. But after that, I will immediately go to the south of France because we have, at my initiative, a first ever retreat of our peacemaking reflection group of former UN retirees. And we have been bedeviled by the challenges that the world faces. We modestly realize we have no role functionally or institutionally at this stage other than as retirees to help those who do have roles and maybe to advise, but we don't want to be a spanner in the works either. And so I'd be very careful about whatever we would burden, even just as communications to the United Nations at this stage. So let me try and pick that essay off. It's actually on my academia.edu profile. If we have a few moments, I'll try and pick it off the web and post it here. But let me close on this and thank you all. And maybe you can address a question to somebody else while I do that homework for you.
We have a question from David Chikvadze.
Yes, hi, and now you can see me.
Hi, David.
Hi. Thank you very much for recognizing me. I've been a little bit reluctant to join because I joined the whole meeting quite late. So I didn't want to speak or sing out of key, which I'm not a singer. I usually sing out of key. But I think my comment would be of a general nature. On the subject of our discussion, we're talking about global turbulence. I think turbulence is something we feel, but the turbulence is not the reason. Turbulence is the result. And I've given a lot of thought before. I don't know if I'll be able to quickly itemize some of the most important things, but I think the turbulence we feel is actually the reason for it is that we're living in a change of eras. That's the most important aspect, I think, and it's creating an upheaval in many aspects of our lives. I think not in any particular order. I think the Westphalian gene in the nation states is spiking with a vengeance, and multilateral mentality is being sidelined. It's the multilateral mentality of the 80-year-old mechanism that was created 80 years ago. It's not overall multilateralism. We see that the nation states are going into LMGs, more and more like-minded groups, which to my mind is a cop-out, because the multilateralism that was created 80 years ago was supposed to serve everybody, and it is supposed to be used by everybody, and it is not being used. And for that reason, they're going into LMGs, and the LMGs actually in the past 30 years have contributed to the sidelining of the universal multilateralism, if we want to identify it as that. Globalization, which was globalization in the economy, world economy, which was already severely ailing, is now being administered successive lethal injections without any clear alternative. Obviously, the whole technological progress, let's call it, focus it to AI, is totally changing everything, every aspect of our lives. And that's adding an underpinning to this whole upheaval and change of eras. And finally, as the world was bracing itself to watch the battle of the reigning superpower to defend its command positions from those who would unseat it, we're seeing a fundamental change of waypoints and principles and policies, and a diffusion of this power, which adds to the change of eras. So I've been using the word we. And this is another point that I want to make very quickly. I think we should define what is we, who is we, because we is very, very non-homogeneous. We is the academic and civil society community. We is nation states. We is armed groups. We is North. We is South. Unless we define it, we're going to be talking in the same generalist manner as we say the Security Council is not able to do something. No, I'm sorry. It's not the Security Council. It's the member states of the Security Council. The Security Council doesn't exist outside or without its member states. It's not an entity unto itself. So that I would change. And finally, I would highly sort of support in every way what Garry was saying, that education is key, because while we are not able to impart directly or get the nation states and the leaders of the world to take on these wonderful, lofty ideas that we're tossing around here and trying to turn into action, what we can do is we can do an end run on today's leaders by educating the future generation, that they will become better leaders than we have today. And really, finally, I mean, it would be great to have leaders. What we have is politicians. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, David. Stephen, I see your hand, but we have a quick question from Sally Kitch.
Thank you for this interesting discussion. I do want to point out some of the conversation that's been in the chat about some of the root causes that are not always identified in conversations like this. We have to actually recognize, first of all, what our previous speaker, David, just said. We are not a we, or we are not a unified we, even those in this group who share a great deal and a lot of values and a lot of intentions. But there are still divisions of interests and power and recognition among us. And I speak primarily for racial and gender differences that change the dynamics of the way groups and nations behave. This is on particularly strong display in the Trump-Musk administration, in which white masculinity is brazenly proposed as the only form of leadership and the only form of policymaking that is worthwhile. What they have said about the SDGs is perfect example of that value system. And I challenge this group and others that you're connected with, that we are all connected with, to have the courage to look at the roles of masculinity and racism, masculinity training and racism in the way the world works and in the solutions that even we propose. I was happy to hear our Irish colleague mention that he's meeting with a group that Mary Robinson used to head. In 2018, Mary Robinson spoke quite frankly about the fact that climate change was a gendered problem that required a feminist solution. She was vilified in certain, I'll call them manospheres, particularly online, for making that statement. But she was a strong believer that paying attention to gendered conditions and gendered policies was required if we're going to change the trajectory of the world that we live in. So this has been discussed a bit in the chat, maybe not attended to by everyone on the panel, but I just wanted to urge that it become part of the conversation in the future.
Great, thank you, Sally. Stephen, your hand is up.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly in response to a couple of the comments that we've heard already. They both Frank and then David were bringing up directly or indirectly the state of multilateralism, and I felt that in the year or so leading up to the Summit of the Future, there was an expressed intention to be revisiting the nature of multilateralism. First of all, I should mention that as being part in a program that has a role, a statutory role within a UN organization, UNESCO, I'm very, very concerned about the fate of the UN as an institution. At the same time, that I can acknowledge and have acknowledged as being within this program, we're a program with one foot in UNESCO and one foot outside of UNESCO. And to that extent, we connect up academia, civil society, and even indigenous groups and local municipalities. It's an odd assemblage that come together around the table together in the Bridges Coalition, and that's by design. And so being a heterogeneous organization in this way, but at the same time being nested within a UNESCO program and therefore a UN program, I've often had occasion to see the unresolved tensions within the multilateral system, and the voice that certain actors get and certain actors don't get. Member states prevail in the UN system, and there was discussion leading up to the Summit of the Future that the idea of a renewed multilateral system, a UN 2.0, would be perhaps prominent, and I don't feel it was as prominent as it could have been and should have been. And I felt that can was kicked down the road in many ways. And so what I'm wondering now is, in the turbulence that we're experiencing, which, as David pointed out, is an effect. Can there be an opportunity for doing what I don't think they followed through on convincingly at the Summit of the Future, and revisioning and revising and rethinking multilateralism so that it is more effective? There are some aspects of multilateralism that just don't work and that allow the multilateral system in some, especially in national context at certain times, that begin looking inward in isolationist terms to vilify the multilateral system. And I think that's unfair, because I think that it's an enormously productive, constructive, and important institution filled with many, many selfless people. In terms of the people who actually get the real work done and who are committed to peace, committed to building a flourishing world. And the structures of the system, though, don't always live up to, I think, the ambitions and the potential of the people who are working within it in that fully, if you think of it in its grandest, broadest sense. So what I would like to do, in following up on a couple of those comments, is to try to center this question about how this can be an opportunity for actually beginning to think about how multilateralism can go beyond the limitations of that 80-year-old structure that don't really speak to the world we're in anymore right now. And rather than pushing it all to the side and giving up and saying, well, I guess that's the end of that, thinking generatively about how we can actually improve upon it and make it more relevant for our times. So.
Thank you, Stephen. Mila, your hand is up.
I'll be brief regarding multilateralism, Steve. It's an interesting geostrategic tectonic shift. And I know David will probably add some thoughts to this so we can think together. An interesting shift where some countries are actually slightly sighing a relief, releasing a relief of a sigh of relief, because the powers may not be as focused on them as they were before. All of a sudden, some people that are dropping through the cracks of those tectonic shifts are maybe relieved partially. Others are terrified, because this is kind of, as much as we do anticipation, and some of the things that are happening are unpredictable because they're depending on a whim of certain leaders, right? And what is interesting that there are alliances emerging in certain regions of the world, and they will be emerging more, that there will be a different kind of multilateralism rising. So there will be unlikely partners, that will emerge out of this. And I think this is why I would love to repeat again, paying attention to what is happening in smaller countries at some key regions in the world, except that there are no inconsequential destinations anymore on the globe. But just the exchange between Ambassador O'Donnell, or should I say Frank, and I on the sides, he was talking about that he led the initiative in which, in his function at the UNDP, he was connecting Montenegro with Costa Rica and their practices for this unprecedented, proclamation of the first ecological state in the world in '91, and setting that terms of reference and collective point of reference for everybody. So the places where certain small countries cannot compete in military, and hopefully we shouldn't, we don't need to, even though we're pushed towards that direction, or through financial systems or other ways, we will be competitive in terms of ethical standards, in terms of new global norms and the capacity to prototype those recommendations on the ground of those small states, and then form alliances in the regions that need to be focalizers and stabilizers in some key spots on the globe.
Thank you, Mila. David, you're next. I wonder if you could maybe answer one of the questions we received on the chat earlier as part of your comment you're going to make now. It was a comment from Juan Long, who asked, who stated, "We seem to give much more weight to a Western view, and so far we have received limited information on how the large Oriental civilizations are willing to move ahead. And in that, I would like to also include Africa, whose population will be 26% of the world's population by 2050. How do we include these big voices, and how do we prevent a Western-oriented, skewed perspective towards the solutions we're talking about?"
Thank you, Grant. I'm sorry for taking the floor a second time, but I just wanted to circle back to something that Stephen was saying, and just draw the line, the distinction between two terms. And I'm not saying that Steve didn't draw the distinction, but in the context of conversation and discussion, these two concepts tend to sometimes be used interchangeably. And I'm referring to what I used, which is multilateral mindset of nation states. And what very often we hear an equality sign between multilateralism and the organization that is seen as a multilateral organization, which is the sort of default. As soon as people hear multilateralism as being sidelined, etc., we think, well, let me get a screwdriver and fix the mechanics. No, that's not the issue. The issue is that the member states' mindset is in a different place. That's why I said that the Westphalian gene was kicking in big time. They are all going into egotistical, I can do all this on my own. That's why they don't need that multilateralism. Now, this situation is not remedied by fixing the organization. And a perfect example of this is the most recent genius pronouncement from the committee that was put together, the UN80, which has recommended that New York and Geneva delocalize some of its posts to less expensive countries. I mean, it's gross mismanagement. Instead of asking the member states to say, what on earth is it that you want the organization to do? First, set the objectives, then talk about money, then talk about staff. I've been saying this for, 2 decades minimum. And I've said this to non-UN audiences, especially when there was a big element of business, saying, can you run a business like this? You call in your hired president to the board of directors meeting, and you say, okay, take this much money, hire 103 persons, and start working. And you say, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. What do I do? He said, we'll tell you later. Just start working. They laugh. I say, of course not in real life. But then why are you making the UN work like that? Why are you cutting budgets and passing it off as reform? The other problem here is that the Summit of the Future that Steve was referring to, unfortunately, was yet another example of the United Nations Secretariat under duress of its member states who don't want to step up to the plate, trying to cut off its own limbs and say, oh, we're reforming. Of course, an organization needs to be reforming, and it's being done all the time. I've spent over 30 years in the UN. We were in constant reform. But what we are lacking is the member states stepping up and saying, okay, boys and girls, you are our organization. We want this organization, as opposed to 1945, we wanted to do X, Y, and Z. For that, we think This is how it should go, not member states representatives coming to a summit meeting in New York and talking about lofty goals and without having the slightest intention of following up on anything. It's just a beauty contest and a way to see and be seen. That's what it is. And the Secretary General is jumping backwards through hoops in order to please the member states, so maybe they'll be lenient to us in the next budget cutting cycle. This is no way to run a railroad. Regarding the question in the chat, once we, again, I'm using the word we, once we use the word we and mean everybody, that's when we will be able to take everybody's views in. Very often, and I've said this in UN meetings back in the day, we would be discussing humanitarian assistance to, I don't know, West African countries or East African countries, and there wouldn't be a single representative of Africa sitting in on the meeting. It would be only donors. Back in when I was in the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, I went to one of my Undersecretaries General and I said, we have this donor interaction group. How about we create a recipient member states group where we brief them exactly the way we brief the donors on the way we spend the money, the donor money. We brief the recipients on where we allocate this and how do we manage this money and what do we hope to achieve with it, and we involve them as well. And we went to the G77 and used that secretariat to bring in all these countries, and it went off like a dream. They loved it. That's the way it should be. But unfortunately, we're all experts in countries that are constantly in the news, or we come from those countries. We can discuss and think that we are great specialists in the domestic politics of America or Great Britain. Do we know what the hell is happening in Nepal or in East Timor, other than those who have served in East Timor? No. Do we know what's happening in Lesotho? No, because it's not in the news. We're not interested. It's not a big player. And we keep forgetting the saying that I think Mila wanted to refer to, is that in the General Assembly, there's no such thing as a small member state. So I'll finish with that. I'm taking up too much time, but it's a very important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Francis, before we come to you, I think Jonathan Granoff had a question earlier.
Oh, I don't have a question. I have a statement, but I'll defer to Francis.
Thank you. Can I go ahead?
Sure.
Okay, thanks, Grant. Well, it's great to hear David once again. Yes, I've been to East Timor. I've been to Lesotho as well. In fact, a long time ago. But we in the UN, when we were in the UN, and we're not in the UN anymore, we also tried at the member state level and at the secretariat level and at the agencies levels to gradually integrate the interests of civil society, to a lesser extent the corporate sector, after the end and only after the end of the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, it was absolutely taboo for organizations like UNDP, let alone any of the others, to work with civil society or the corporate sector. But after the end of the Cold War, it started happening. And in the Habitat Conference, the second Human Settlements Conference in Istanbul in 1996, we designed it in such a way that there were fora also for municipalities and local governments. But let me also say that there's at least one organization, and there may be more now, in the UN, which have a tripartite governance structure, the ILO, for example, which brings together not just the member states, but also the trade unions and others. So you have this multi-stakeholder forum. And I think what we need is a multi-stakeholder form of multilateralism, not just a state-based form. And Boutros Ghali, when he spoke to us from Cairo on his deathbed about a decade ago, those of us who were meeting in Baku at the Global Baku Forum, he said to us, he said, the nation state is not the only game in town. Now you have civil society in the corporate sector and so on. And we need to have processes that are more inclusive of those interests. Indeed, perhaps different fora or assemblies that would connect into the UN. And I know that this is happening at the level of the General Assembly in a particular kind of way. But I want to just close by mentioning one other thing. And of course, but before I do that, UN 80 and what David was saying sounds to me like there's a lot of influence there from Doge-UN, which would be the other animal that's arrived on the scene. And surprisingly, Vuk Jeremic, former president of the UNGA, is involved in that. I don't know what his latest thoughts on it are. I have asked him to share them with me because I know him for the past 30 years, having served in Belgrade and also, of course, for Mila in Montenegro. The thing I wanted to say is actually to focus in a little bit on Serbia. And because a student movement in Serbia has been gaining great strength, it's no longer just a student movement, it's a student movement plus professionals, academics, people of different types, reaching out to all the villages all the way up to Novi Pazar and spreading across Europe in the largest movement, and I use these words carefully, the largest movement of student and people-led activism across Europe since May 1968. And this is something which absolutely has to be taken note of to see where it goes. It started out as a fight against corruption. It's now going for a regime change and a bunch of other things. But they have been met just in the past few days by the foreign minister of Austria, who basically said, what you are fighting for is what we want in the EU. It's what the European Union is all about. And therefore, it's an appeal to close that black hole of the Western Balkans in the EU, surrounded by the EU, but not yet in the EU, which goes back to the Thessaloniki Declaration, that they should all be joining into the EU in 2013. And that came about as a result of conversations at the funeral of the late Zoran Djindjic 10 years prior in 2003. And it still hasn't happened. And that's the big challenge in the Balkans. But I think, this has been a very exciting panel. I'm very glad that I could participate in it. I will have to leave now because other duties calling me. So thank you all very much.
Please
Yeah,
don't
thank
leave
you.
until
Thank you so much for your
full
time.
respect. Thank you so much. Your knowledge is exceptional. Your sensitivity is exceptional. You've been in the streets with people, it's apparent, right along with policymakers. And I'm blown away. I was reluctant to speak about Serbia, so it doesn't sound like I'm Balkan-centric, but that's a new term, and it will become very relevant. That's the whole point. I'm so grateful to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amanda, you've made a comment that you have seen a lot of duplication and overlap in the international architecture. Would you like to comment on that?
No, Jonathan had a comment I thought he wanted to make.
Yes,
Don't
you
forget.
had a statement.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Modernity is a preoccupation with technique. It begins with the Industrial Revolution. It begins in the 17th century, the application of the scientific method to doing things. And the why, the telos and purpose, has now been occluded by the how. So we have art without beauty, religion about rites, rituals, and practices without transcendence and love. We have philosophy in our universities about the methodology of philosophy. We have our financial system operating independently of the production of goods and services. We have the greatest paradox of all being the nuclear venture in which we produce weapons. The more we perfect, the less security we get. And we've forgotten the very purpose of the state, which is to provide security and peace for people. Because the dialogue and the dialogue politically is entirely about efficiencies of methodologies of how, with very little discussion of fulfilling the human endeavor. I believe that one of the insights of the founders of WAAS was not the World Academy of Science, which is just a way of knowing things in a very methodological fashion, but really was really science and technology, the application of science. But it's the art, and what is the art that's needed now is the art of articulating values and meaning. The forces of provincialism, religious zealotry, ethnic identity that are pulling the world apart are filling the vacuum of the promotion of the universal values that we all adhere to. And we've inadequately explained to the public why democracy is important, why human rights are important, why fundamental freedoms are important, and why the underlying ethical values that support those institutions are important. And I think that part of our mandate is to bring that ethical, value-driven, universal value discussion into centrality, because that is the why. As the great insight of the manifesto of Russell and Einstein said, remember your humanity, forget the rest. And what they're really saying is, remember those values of kindness and love and compassion that makes us human. That's part of our human purpose. They were saying, remember the why.
Thank you, Jonathan. Amanda?
In many ways, Jonathan, I think we should just finish there because that was so beautifully poetic. It seems my very transactional comments may be inappropriate, but I did want to say, having been both New Zealand's permanent representative to the UN and having worked inside the World Bank, there are justifiable frustrations on the behalf of small countries. The architecture is just so complicated, and we're very good at setting up new initiatives and more new initiatives and very bad at closing things down. And there are so many overlaps between what UNDP does, what the World Bank does. I mean, there are so many overlaps. And I think that is one of there needs to be a streamlining. But I also think that we in the Western world are culpable because we have not allowed the shifts, for example, a rising China paying a significant amount at both the IMF and the World Bank to have a commensurate share in voting rights, with the result that we have seen the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank set up, we have seen the BRICS Bank set up, we have seen the rise of the BRICS. And I was quite shocked last year in October when I was at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa to find Prime Minister Modi not there, but rather with Putin in Russia, along with 32 other countries who are thinking about joining the BRICS. So I think we need to be very clear-eyed that there is a new order that is emerging. And you've seen China with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's a whole range of small things that were being floated. And the BRICS originally had only 5 members, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, if there are 32, they expanded to 9 last year, but I was quite shocked. So I think we need to be very sanguine as the World Academy of what is happening more broadly. And I'm sorry if you've already discussed the BRICS, but it's something that I've been watching with some alarm. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Amanda. I think this is a good time to wrap up. Just a reminder, we will be continuing this conversation in June, July at a 3-day online conference hosted by WAAS. We'll keep you updated. This is all being recorded and transcribed and put into documents. Please look out for emails with summaries of our discussion today. And we look forward to hopefully hosting you again in June, July. Garry, any closing comments from you before we end the session?
Just thank you again, everyone, for your contributions. Very rich discussion.
Great. Well, thank you to everybody and to everybody who was listening and to the panelists and the moderators, and look forward to continuing this discussion.